Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Graduate School of Architecture Practice Lecture Series. It's a series of lectures that we're hosting for the course of this semester, where we've invited a range of different practitioners to share with the school and the wider community the nature of their practice, how they practice, why they practice, where they studied, to give us a kind of look inside the practices that operate in South Africa and internationally. And we have a wide range of practitioners participating in the series this year. Particularly interesting will be the group this evening, who are all recent graduates of the Graduate School of Architecture. And I'm going to introduce them shortly and contextualize what we hope that they will be presenting with us. But we do hope that you participate and attend in the entire lecture series. Next week, we have Melanie Archer, who studied architecture, but now practices as a designer in Trinidad and Tobago, and she'll be presenting at this time next week. So that's the next part of the series. But this evening, we're going to be focusing on 4 recent graduates of the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. So, gives me great pleasure to introduce 4 graduates of the school, and I just want to ask them if they could just briefly turn their cameras on and introduce themselves. First of all, Chinenye Chukwuka, who's here with us at the GSA this evening. Welcome, Chinenye. I'd like to welcome Titus Shitaatala, who graduated last year from the GSA, and Titus is joining us from Cape Town, where he's currently working. Patricia Bandora, who's joining us this evening from Tanzania, from Dar es Salaam. Welcome, Patricia. Lovely to have you with us this evening. And finally, Simphiwe Mlambo, who's also with us here at the GSA this evening. Welcome, Simphiwe. We're looking forward to your presentation. Thank you. So I'm just going to speak a little bit to contextualize each of these practitioners, because I think they're all really interesting. And what we've done in the series so far is most of the practitioners have been what I would call middle stage practitioners or late stage practitioners, but these are all what I would call early stage practitioners. They're all recent graduates, but they are formulating their practices. And we thought it would be really interesting to include them in this series so that we can get some insight into what graduates are doing on graduating from the GSA, what their interests and motivations are, to get some insight into the type of work they're doing. And they are all doing a range of very interesting things that I'm sure you will find fascinating. Each of them is going to give a 15-minute presentation this evening. And as I said, they will transition directly into each other. I'll do a brief intro before we move to them. But I'd just like to talk through, give you a little profile of each of them, starting with Chinenye. So Chinenye is a candidate architect. She's a curator. She's a researcher. And she says her practice intertwines architecture, lived experiences, and art to curate spaces and content for accessible and engaging use. She works between Cape Town and Johannesburg, and with roots in Lagos, Nigeria, Chinenye explores urban landscapes in African cities, focusing on migration, agency, and community adaptation. She'll be the first of our speakers this evening. The second presenter is Titus. Titus is from Namibia. He's a candidate architect. He's a digital artist and an archivist. He graduated from the GSA last year with a distinction. He's also received the Vice Chancellor's Award. He's interested in exploring how spaces can go beyond their physical existence to become storytelling mediums of memories, narratives, and meaning. His approach lies in understanding how people connect with spatial narratives through intricate spatial arrangements, materiality, and construction techniques, going beyond traditional architecture to integrate visual arts, film, and sculpture to expand on the storytelling potential of spaces. So that's an overview of Titus's practice. Patricia Bandora is an award-winning architect and researcher from Tanzania. She graduated from the GSA with a distinction, and her interests lie in the relationship between colonialism and architecture and the challenge of decolonizing the latter and making it an instrument for deconstructing the past, learning and preserving African systems and applying them to the built environment, spatial and urban planning in the continent. And the last presenter this evening will be Simphiwe Mlambo. And Simphiwe describes herself as an Afrocentric architectural researcher and educator. She also graduated from the GSA with a distinction. She lectures at the University of Johannesburg Department of Architecture and also teaches here at the GSA, where she is a tutor with Ngillan Faal's Unit 7. Her teaching methods, exemplified by the one-to-one project, reimagine design for the body, exploring haptic and tectonic space in collaboration with Y Think Tank in 2024. So that's a brief overview of the speakers for this evening. I'm going to hand over to Chinenye shortly. So I'll ask the others to turn their cameras off. And if I could ask everybody else who's attending this meeting, and thank you all very much for coming and attending, make sure that you keep yourself muted and make sure you keep your cameras off during the course of this. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please drop them in the chat. You can also put your hand up at the end of the meeting, whatever you're comfortable with doing, and we'll do a sort of recap at the end. But if it is a question that is directed to a specific or particular presenter, make sure you include their name. So if you have a question for Patricia, say at Patricia or to Patricia. If it's to Chinenye, similarly, make sure that you indicate their name. So at the end, we'll know who to direct the question to. And again, at the end, we will also provide information on how you can claim for your CPD points for attending this presentation. So that's enough from me. I'm really excited about this evening. I'm really excited to hear and to see and to learn more about what these graduates are doing, how their practices are emerging. And before I introduce them, just to let you know that each of these practitioners are being featured in an exhibition, EP2, Emergent Practice 2, that will be held at the Goethe-Institut. The first part of that exhibition, EP1, has recently closed. The second part will open with work by all of these practitioners and co-curated by Chinenye Chukwuka, who's co-curated it with Ngillan Faal. So you can find out more information about that exhibition on our social media channels. So I'm going to hand over now to Chinenye and ask her to share her presentation with us. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and hello from everyone who's calling in from away of South Africa. I'm Chinenye, and I'm really excited to present my practice today. Obviously, when you're asked to present your practice and you've just left school, it can be a bit jarring because what do I present? But I think to start my practice off, I like to talk about objects and things that have led me to this particular point in where I am. And an object that is often synonymous with me is my orange wallet. And this wallet was created by a friend and colleague in my first year of architecture school, Caleb Bell. And he had designed these wallets from plastic he had found on the roof of Roelof Eitenburghat's Vadmuller Center in Claremont. He found this plastic and he cut it up into smaller envelope pieces and turned them into these wallets that he'd given out to a few of us in the class. Till this day, I have this wallet. And in it, I collect a variation of objects, cards, receipts, money, things that give me some semblance of adulthood. Yet, because of how practical this wallet is and how beautiful it is, orange is my favorite color, I've kept this wallet for the last seven to 8 years. And in the same way, many things in my life have led me to this point, collecting objects and experiences that have led me to practice architecture in the way that I do. One of the first experiences I can remember, I was born in Oba, in Anambra State, Nigeria, and I grew up in Lagos, and my dad used to take us to the Lagos National Museum, where we would see the threshold and ran a beautiful mosque and Murtala Muhammad's vehicle and objects that spoke to the history of Nigeria. But as a 5-year-old or 6-year-old child, I didn't particularly have any meaning to, but I loved the way that they sat in space and they told a story that my dad was excited to share with me. A third thing that was a very big part of an architectural experience was my grandfather's house on my maternal side. He'd built this house in the 90s, but he had never completed it. And it sat on the same plot as his original mud house, adobe house that he had grown up in as a child. And this building is designed as 4 flats designed around an atrium, allowing for him and his 3 sons to live in this house into old age. And I thought this house was one of the most beautiful houses I'd ever seen or experienced. Until this day, when I visit, I'm always like in admiration by the architect that designed it, who was probably just a draftsman, but the way they had thought about the longevity of a family in a space. Similarly to this, again, I think about things that my mother had did, and growing up, she had always been a woman part of her groups or women groups in Nigeria. And an object that curates space in the way that I've seen it has been fabrics, West African fabrics that when you wear, open up different spaces that you can occupy. Some of these fabrics can be the Anglican Women's Church uniform. Some of them can be the Moaba's women's uniform, and only married women can wear these uniforms. Only women belonging to Anglican Church can wear these uniforms. For your wedding, you have particular geles or a chafo that you can put on your head. And these objects in their own way curate spaces that you can occupy. And these are things that have always been experiences growing up that showed me the space is not only what someone says it is, but the objects that occupy them. And so these 4 or 5 spaces converge and they create who I am. So born in Enugu, from Oba, lived in Lagos, grew up in Cape Town, and now practicing in Johannesburg, these confluences and these spaces have kind of brought themselves into this meeting point for me, where my culture, the cities that I occupy emerge to show the way that or influence the way that I look at the world and practice architecture. And so when I start from school, I'm not presenting my thesis in any way, but my research, and this is something that's very important to me, is centered around documenting urban landscapes, particularly in African cities, where I focus on themes of migration, agency, and adaptation. Through my work, I strive to capture the resilience and ingenuity of migrant communities as they navigate and reshape the spaces they inhabit. This journey has led me to develop multifaceted approaches to curation, one that intertwines architecture, anthropology, and storytelling. And that's the best way I can summarize it. I like to work with my hands. I like to think about how people use space and adapt it for theirs. And I like to work with fabrics, tapestry, sewing, collage, and just taking photographs of how people use spaces. So one of my first projects that I got to do with the GSA, and this was something that was quite important for me, moving from UCT to Joburg, was I had to change how I looked at architecture, not just as plan, section, and elevation, but as interior spaces that people occupied that didn't need to be drawn up in plan or section. How else could you draw a space that people occupied? How could you draw a space for someone who can't read plan? And this led me to axonometrics, tapestry, again, collage, because when you show someone a picture of their space, they're more likely to recognize it and say, I know what you're talking about. This led me into Hillbrow, a space that has an amazing history, but one now that is a space known as Little Nigeria. So as a Nigerian in the classroom, obviously I was prompted to go in and see what people kept calling Little Nigeria. And to my surprise, it is. It is a space where there are so many cultures. And as you walk through, you hear Igbo, you hear Venda, you hear Zulu, you hear Shona. And as you walk through, you see the different barriers of different spaces that immigrants have created for themselves through markets and through just occupying a city that is not necessarily welcoming to them, but they create spaces that welcome them in. And so my work deals very much with the body and the body in space, and often the migrant body and how that occupies a space of waiting, a space. What do you do when you immigrate? What do you do? How do you make home when home is far away? How do you make home palatable? How do you make business? How do you make things of enjoyment? And how do you adapt that urban fabric to meet you where you are? In my master's, I got to deal with the same thing. I wanted to keep working with migrants, but I found out that the Johannesburg landscape is littered with mines. And in that same way, I got to play with the body, the scale, and what the scale of the body does in mines, and who's occupying those spaces that are now closed. So mines have been decommissioned, but we have Zamazamas that occupy these spaces till this day, not because they want to, but because they need to. And so a tactic that I learned in my practice is subverting the gaze, creating beautiful images that allow people to come in and look at the work, only to find out that the topics being discussed are quite serious and quite morbid. So in this drawing, I have a Zama crossing a ledge underground. And what my thesis proposed, as illegal as it was designing a brick factory above ground that masked the process of mining, so that to start mining, you had to make bricks. And so eventually these miners would be rehabilitated into brick makers. But, when you do things like this, you can't do that in the real world. You have to do this in school because you can think about anything you want to do. Again, my practice or my methodologies often work with my hands, creating things with texture, things that are eye-catching, because it's fun to do, but it's also nice to physically see and create space with your hands and see how you can show something outside of a drawing. So why I'm presenting today is because something that I often kept saying was that I wanted to be a curator. And at the time when I had mentioned it, I wasn't particularly sure what curation meant. I knew it meant making pretty spaces. I knew it meant a white box that I could fill with things. And what UJ and the GSA allowed me to do was to kind of gain experience in that space. I got to participate with Zanele Maholi's Women's Mobile Museum in 2022. And I got to curate the Unit 7 space. And in these times, things that we often take for granted, we get to see one-to-one scale. We get to see what it means to source paint, what it means to source fabric, what it means to listen to an artist and put their work in the best way they want their work to be presented. And now, luckily for me, I took my time. I got the pleasure. My parents were very forgiving and caring, and I had the privilege to take a break in December, Jan until March, and think about what I really wanted to do. And that's opened this new chapter for me where I am currently working with LSP, Library Special Projects, a firm of multifaceted, multidisciplinary. So we are architects, curators, researchers who come together to create public space, creating and designing museum spaces in particular in detail. And this has been life-changing for me because prior to this, I didn't know that you could have a practice that ran just on designing and making museums. Yet every day I get to go to work and I get to work in these spaces. And I think this leads me to where I am now, the Dunning-Kruger effect. So due to my NDA, I can't really show the work that I work on. But something that my boss showed me in the first 2 months of work was the Dunning-Kruger effect. And so when you start with work, it's confidence based on competence. And there's like peak of Mount Stupid, the valley of despair, and then the plateau of sustainability. And when I jumped into the firm, I was like, I've got ideas, I can do this. But you learn very quickly that like someone who's been working in this practice for 20 years has way more experience and understanding of how things work. And changing the way we see scale, having to detail how an object sits in space is not something that's easy. So right now I'm here, but eventually one day I will be at plateau of sustainability. And I think just for a reflection on EP1 posters, getting to work, design alongside Fred Swart and listen to his work, listen to how he wanted to see his space, and then design the space and the techniques of which the work would be hung was something very valuable to me and eye-opening, because often you realize the curator is one person who can think of things, but you need a team that is willing and open to listening to you and able to execute exactly what you want to get up on the walls. And so these are reflection pictures of the space. And I hope that the ones of you who were in Joburg were able to see. And those of you who couldn't see EP1, I urge you to come see EP2 because it will be amazing. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you so much, Chinenye. That's a really lovely insight into the work you're doing and engagement with curation. Thank you so much for sharing. So we're going to move straight to Titus next. And again, just to let you know that if you do have a question, you can ask it at the end of all of four, or in the meantime, you can just drop the question into the chat so that we can collect it. But make sure if you do drop a question into the chat, make a note of to whom the question is directed. So when we go back to look at it, we'll know who you're asking the question to. So now joining us from Cape Town, Titus Shitaatala, who graduated last year. So over to you, Titus. Looking forward to your presentation.
So my name is Titus Shitaatala, as Mark mentioned. I'm really excited to show my work. Allow me a few moments to share my screen. So my name is Titus Shitaatala. I'm originally from Namibia. I completed my undergrad at the Namibian University of Science and Technology, and did my postgrad at the Graduate School of Architecture at UJ. So I'm interested in looking at space as an instrument for the expression of narratives and meanings. So I'm quite interested in how people connect to space through spatial arrangement, detailing, materiality, construction techniques, and spatial sequencing. But I also like to approach my work in a way that brings awareness to the fact that we are ancestors right now as well. And we have an active role in how spaces will be created in the future and what narratives will we be taking forward into the future. So these themes are sort of themes that I've flirted with throughout my student career or my student throughout being a student, and it's finally come to full circle, I would say, in my master's year last year, where I was in Unit 20 and it was highly focused on storytelling. So it was sort of the perfect playground for me to really nurture my practice and my approach and the way I'm interested in working. So my thesis was about Marabatar and basically creating an archive in the year 2045 for the Marabastad community, basically empowering them and allowing them to record their own histories and decide how they would like their histories to regenerate through the construction of their archive. So it began with researching Marabastad memories and where exactly the memories and meanings are embedded in. In this case, it happened to be in materiality and through these objects that they use every day. And that led me to designing an archive for them to tell their stories, but also doing it in such a way that it allows them to record their histories and question this history. So it's not just a case where so it's a case where future generations also get to question histories and write manifestos for their futures. In it being a speculative project, I also wanted to approach it in such a way that you could also get details from it. You could also, there's a real tangible aspect to it, even though it's largely speculative. So my research delves or operates in the context zones between the speculative, but also how this could be integrated or into the real world, or how it could be realized. And with it being placed in the future, there's also a lot of research that has been done in sort of integrating it into where we're headed and integrating the fourth industrial revolution into the work itself. So this was a robotic arm, which would be the contractor of the archive, programmed by the community to record their histories. The ongoing speculative projects that I have going on right now. So I'm working on an art exhibition in Namibia, and it basically follows the storyline of working with the fourth industrial revolution to sort of mitigate some of the issues that we face today. But then later along the line, other issues are presented pertaining to usage of the fourth industrial revolution. So the whole idea behind it is that while there are amazing opportunities, there are also things that we should be wary about when when integrating the fourth industrial revolution and familiarizing with it. So one of these projects is creating a sacred space. So a space that studies, using AI studies a person who could be regarded as an ancestor in the future. And when this person is no longer there, the space that they're in becomes a sacred space where it could basically be consulted. And in consulting the space, it becomes you consulting an ancestor. But it's done in such a way that the fourth industrial revolution is integrated, and it really brings the question of how do we perceive what does this mean for ancestry in the future? Yeah, so that's just one of them. And beyond this, so as Mark mentioned, I'm also a digital artist. I also think a lot about how these ideas of mine, or this practice or approach of mine, could be communicated beyond just architecture, or beyond audiences that understand architecture. So the whole idea is getting it out there and getting it to reach as many people as possible. So one way to do that is through the visual artwork that I do. So in my exhibitions, it usually follows a certain sequence that allows people to sort of tap into it, and it can reach wider audiences. And another way I also do this is through film work. Again, touching on the whole idea of storytelling. And this is something that is an opportunity that I found, because as architects, these are tools that we're exposed to and that are available to us. A model that you have, a program that you can use, is always something that you could use to go beyond architecture and create something that could sort of be understood, or could reach wider audiences. So another way in which I'm sort of growing my practice is through competitions. And the good thing about competitions, and why I think they're so important, is that it gets me out of my comfort zone, where when I'm researching things that I'm interested in, I'm sort of putting less constraints on myself. So it's very interesting to see how I can use competitions to sort of express my practice and my approach, while also growing my skills and gauging where it sits and how it's received, and also exposing it internationally. So an example of a competition I've done is the Kuranza competition with my cousin Armas. So the brief was to design a women's center in Mozambique. And the idea here, the approach was, we sort of started with finding out what held a lot of meaning for these women in this particular area. And something that we found was the Capulana cloth from Mozambique, which basically is a cloth that is woven by the women, and it comes in a standard size. So the idea was to sort of see how we could integrate it into the design as much as possible, allowing the women to create their surrounding, while also passing down this knowledge to younger generations. And it becomes a building that they can go on and maintain for themselves as well. The other side of what I do is the work that I do in practice, or the work that I do currently. So I work for BPAS Architects in Cape Town. I've done some work in Namibia as well. I've worked briefly in Namibia as well. And even though sometimes it doesn't really tap into my approach or what I want to do, it's still work that I can sort of learn from, and sort of understand the existing practice modules and understand different user needs. So one of the projects that I worked on in Namibia was the design of a hospital for the Himba community in Namibia. For those who don't know, the Himba community in Namibia are very deeply rooted in their tradition and their culture. So their approach to their everyday life is deeply rooted in their cultural beliefs, and they haven't really been as westernized as the rest of the Namibian communities. And the dilemma we had for this project was we needed to design a hospital, but the issue was a lot of the people in the area weren't really comfortable with the westernized sort of type of healing. They would much rather be comfortable in their own spaces of healing. So the practice that I was working for at the time, we approached it in sort of trying to find out what this meaning was for the Himba people when it comes to healing. And we looked at integrating it into the hospital design. So there was one side of it, which was the westernized methods of healing, but then there were also spaces where these people could practice what they're used to traditionally. Another project that I did in Namibia was the Shikuku Heritage Restaurant. So this was situated up north in an area which is we predominantly find Oshuambo speaking people. And here I tried to look at the spatial arrangement of Oshuambo eating spaces, and also some of the construction techniques that they use. So the research here was more finding out how they sort of already construct their spaces, and how they typically want to navigate through their spaces, and then finding a way to integrate it into sort of a more contemporary approach. Yeah, so this one was quite exciting. But most of the work that I do has nothing to do with what I'm interested in. But at the end of the day, it's what gives me sort of a freedom, or gets the ship rolling and allowing me to do what I'm interested in. So they sort of feed on each other, and something else that beyond architecture, I also look to use my skills in other disciplines. So I try to take advantage of the skills that I've gained in architecture. For example, in creative direction. So I work with the Namibia Journal of Social Justice in Namibia, and I provide creative direction for the journal. So there's an edition that comes out each year. But then this is just another approach that I base my practice in. And currently, I'm also working on some settlement profiles with a Namibian institution, which allows, or which looks at bringing people, or bringing communities into the design of their spaces, which is sort of what I'm already interested in, and what I try and do with my work. So yeah, in a nutshell, yeah, that is my practice. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Titus. That's really great insight, and really fascinating for me to see some of the work that you've done outside of the work that you've produced here at the school. And thank you so much for sharing. So I see Pinda's hand is up. Pinda, just to let you know, we're going to take questions at the end for all of them, rather than taking a break between them. So please either hold your question, I'll invite it at the end, or you could even type it in the chat just to remind us that you have a question, and we'll certainly be entertaining your thoughts and any questions you have. So thank you, Titus. Now we're going to move to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where Patricia Bandora is joining us from. Patricia, welcome. Lovely to see you, and thanks for joining us this evening. We're really excited to see your presentation and what you're up to. So I'm going to hand over to you. Looking forward to seeing what you can share with us this evening.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Just give me a few moments while I get my presentation up. But it's nice to see a great turnout. Just to start. Okay, good evening. As introduced, my name is Patricia Bandora. I am a researcher, architect, and writer from Tanzania and based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. Firstly, I'd like to thank the GSA, my alma mater, for inviting me to share with you my journey and experiences so far. And Archive as practice, preserving African knowledge systems through architecture, I view as an ongoing document which highlights my past and current activities and experiences. Archive, practice, preserving African knowledge systems, and architecture are words and phrases which define and motivate my practice or what I do. And in taking you through this journey, I'd like to begin with what I call the point of no return, which is my master's thesis, The Port of Evidence Reconstructing the Missing Black Box of the 1994 Rwandan Genocide against the Tutsi. And I call this the point of no return because I think the investigation, which was motivated by my personal experience as being half Rwandan, it reassured me of my research or what I'd like to research, and which is critiquing and investigating the archive as it's written archive and written in the colonial perspective, and its role and position it takes within the context of post-colonial Africa. And so my thesis generally is a combination of data collection through archive, mapping, using myself as a research subject in consulting the archive to investigate the genocide, in calling for the existence of an oral archive. So how does architecture facilitate the existence of an oral archive? And how does that preserve African knowledge systems? Because as we know, African history is passed down orally instead of written. But still understanding the need for the written archive in order to be critiqued. So how do these two come together and how do they act against each other? And upon graduating my master's thesis, I was given the opportunity to work with Professor Antonio Toma on the Angolan Civil War. I think he was inspired by some of the maps that I had created for my master's thesis because we worked on a number of maps in investigating the Battle of Cuito Cuanavale, which was one of the battles that took place in the Angolan Civil War, where I started working with Professor Antonio Toma on the Angolan Civil War and working on mapping and archive and data collection. I think in working with these types of tools, I was able to further my interest and my, I guess, motivations in my practice, because I was able to practice my mapping, I was able to collect more archival data, and also continue to critique the position of the archive. If you go to the next slide. And so what this led to is a series of different mappings in different perspectives, not just the conventional mapping as we know it, but how can mapping be viewed in different perspectives, not
Sure.
Not in your general perspective. And then if you go to the next slide. I think my master's thesis, as I call it, the point of no return, really bore fruit as I was invited by the Rwandan government to present my master's thesis at the 30th anniversary for the commemoration of the lost victims in the Rwandan genocide against the Tutsi. It was a very humbling experience because I was able to present my thesis and reach a wider audience and be able to share my thoughts about who I am and my motivations and why I chose to critique the archive and specifically the Rwandan genocide. If you go next. And so my experience was a great one. I was able to present in front of students, architectural students, members of state, journalists, and I had a lot of insight and a lot of questions. I think it was also very nerve-wracking because these are people who have lived the genocide and of course have a better understanding of it than I have, but still experiencing it positively was again a very humbling and a huge learning curve for me. If you go next. And so in presenting, in data collection and archiving, I also really enjoy writing and scholarship. And I think, not only through architecture, but through writing to again reach a wider audience. And I was given the opportunity to present on architecture education, to be a part of a roundtable series with two of my fellow classmates, Famida and Cindy, on architecture education, where we spoke about our experiences with architecture as women of color. And again, in this, it was during my honors year, but I still knew that the archive was something that I wanted to continue, or I wanted to critique, in reference to Achille Mbembe and the likes. And this year, the Funambulist as well approached me to publish my master's thesis, or a piece of my master's thesis, specifically the part about mapping genocide, and how the role of media in the genocide. If you go next. And I think the biggest, challenge that we face as academics, as architects and researchers, is how do we now reach a wider audience apart from the institution? How do we reach the everyday person about what we want to and what we want to do as architects? And I was given this opportunity when I started working for a firm here in Dar es Salaam on an exhibition project, which is called Histories of Tanzania. And here I saw all the things that I loved to do with architecture come together: archive, African knowledge systems, and architecture. And Histories of Tanzania is briefly, just to briefly speak on it, is a restitution project which is about bringing back stolen art, colonial artifacts back to Tanzania from Germany. But before they do that, they would like to host an exhibition in Berlin in the Humboldt Forum. And these objects will then be returned back to Tanzania. And so I am the project architect for this exhibition project. And it's been a great experience because it began with looking at the archive, and documenting the erasure. So these objects are objects which are documented differently in the written archive than when you interview Tanzanians or descendants of the original owners of the objects. And so it's about documenting this unwritten history. And then further to that, it's about how do we design for these objects? How do we occupy the Humboldt Forum? If some of you are familiar with the Humboldt Forum, it's a very controversial building. But how do we occupy this exhibition room in the Humboldt Forum with Tanzania? And so if you go next, this started from looking at the typical Tanzanian basket or vegetable basket. And it started looking at a typical basket, a fruit basket, a fish basket, which is commonly used in Tanzania, and how we can preserve the idea of weaving into the exhibition. So looking at this African knowledge system of weaving, this is a Kagome weaving, which is, it's worldwide, but it's also used in Tanzania traditionally. And how we can now replicate this into these protected structures or installations which house these objects. How do we pay respects for these objects which were stolen? And so it was a series of sketches and looking at a prototype of the basket and looking at different atmospherical properties or characteristics of these so-called installations, or we call them spheres or knots. If you go to the next slide. And so it was a huge operation where we looked for weavers from villages across Tanzania, which was actually very funny, fun, stressful. But what we saw here is a sort of kind of merging of architecture and African knowledge systems, because we were creating such complex, as you can see in the image on the right, we were creating such complex 3D models of the shape or the image of what we wanted to manifest. And it was a learning curve for us and the weavers of how to translate this to them. But they not immediately, but they got it eventually. And what you had is this, farmer who weaves for fun or as a hobby, reading these complex maps of weaving, kagome weaving. So it was a project in collaboration with the Royal Danish Academy as well, and the Humboldt Forum and the National Museum of Tanzania. And then if you go to the next slide. And so to accompany these, I forgot to mention the material, they're bamboo weaving. So to accompany the bamboo weaving on the floor, in order to continue this concept of occupying space, decolonizing space, we're using these mats, which are traditionally made by women in the villages of Tanzania, and they're made of a grass called milulu. And these mats are huge. They're 4.5 meters by 4 meters long, and they're hexagonal shaped. So again, how do we translate architecture and merge it into this idea of African knowledge systems or African or weaving styles? And how do we combine them to create something beautiful? And so again, here it was also a difficult task in explaining that you can make hexagonal mats because they're used to making oval and circular and square mats. And then you introduce a 6-sided shape, people automatically say it's not possible. So it was a series of visiting these villages, going through a series of prototypes, and eventually them getting it. And you can see it's a huge operation where there's 8 women weaving 1 mat, and we have about 30 mats. So timeline-wise, it's incredibly big, and we're still working on it. So it's an ongoing project. And if you go next to the next slide. And yeah, and I'd like to end off with, I'm still figuring out what my practice has something to do with how we can merge architecture with existing knowledge systems, and in order to preserve them so that they, don't get lost in how we design our future cities. Thank you.
Hey, that's lovely, Patricia. I know we had a few glitches, but I still think we managed to get through it without any interruptions. Really fascinating work, and congratulations on what's looking like a really extraordinary practice. So thank you so much. Okay, so that's Patricia, who's joined us from Tanzania. And of course, there'll be an opportunity to ask questions at the end. I'd encourage you all, if you have questions, to drop your questions into the chat, or wait till the end and you can put your hand up and we'll field them directly. So now, joining us from here at the GSA, I'd like to introduce Simphiwe Mlambo, who, as I said, is teaches at the Department of Architecture and the undergraduate programs, and is also a valuable member of teaching staff at the GSA, working as a unit tutor in Unit 7 with Ngillan Faal and Notando. I'm looking forward to your presentation, Simphiwe. I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Good evening. Hello, hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you to my fellow speakers for the amazing presentations and giving me a lot to work towards. Please give me a couple of minutes to share my screen. I'm going to try something a little bit different when it comes to my emerging practice. So if everybody can bear with me, I'd really appreciate it. Sanibonani nonke, igama lami uSimphiwe Mlambo. Ngifundele ukuba umakhi University of Johannesburg, all the way from the undergrad school till I graduated with my master's at the GSA. Bathe namhlanje ngintshele ngaloku engidume ngako, which is architecture. But ngintshele ngepractice yami. To be honest, I'm not sure ukuthi ngizonitshelani, but I'm interested in letting you guys into what I have lovingly stolen from Mxolisi Makubu, which is my mixtape of thoughts around my emerging practice. My emerging practice deals with the idea of narrative as architecture, where I deal with being confronted with how I couldn't express myself and the Black spatial imaginary in the way that I was taught to practice architecture. My research interest sits in the realm of narrative design, mythology, production of prophecy as false cartographies of the Black spatial imaginary. My practice evolves in teaching, research, and the practice of practicing, and how these narratives manifest as a tool for myself to develop a architectural practice. That was a lot of practice. About the way that I work, I really like words, but the thing is, English is not my mother tongue. So in my experience, I tend to always translate myself. But what started to happen in my practice in academia through my master's was that I started to question what words meant, because every time I tried to use it, I would realize after every tutorial, after every crit session, that I don't know what the word means. So today is what I probably should have called in hindsight presentation of what my emerging practice is. It's going to run multi-scalar, which is what I think my practice is, through the body and the cartography, using the change in definition of emerging and practice to help myself understand the question I've been asked around what my emerging practice is. Since I like narrative so much, I'm going to tell everyone a story. When I was younger, I hated reading with my entire chest. So my parents would buy me these audiobooks, and they're called Poldy books. And what was really great about it is it allowed me as a child to mimic the act of reading, but train my ear as a way to listen and see the world. But I was also really competitive. So I entered myself into a reading competition in grade 1, where I was told to read a ton of books. This Poldy book section has about 12 to 15, but I'd memorized it so well that I was able to go up, present, and win, even though I didn't know what I was reading. The practice that emerged was that I've trained my ear to see the world, and that sort of dictates the way that my practice has emerged recently. This emergence has gone into a podcast with a collective I call YBA, where myself and my colleagues in architecture begin to discuss, think about, and process our practices through the act of listening and sound in a podcast series.
And funny enough, in architecture school, in my undergraduate, nobody spoke about it in history either, right? So in my undergraduate, I don't know that also the reason I come from the township, there's a reason behind that. Somebody actually decided, sat down and said, this is where I'm going to put black people. This is where I'm going to put colored people, Indian people. And then there's going to be a town. And then this is where I'm going to put white people, right? So I didn't know that there was a whole order to it and how much impact that it would have on a person's life.
My family is currently part of group of people whose land has been taken and have been for the past, I think, 10 years fighting this legal battle, getting this particular land back from us. It is where we've been displaced.
Later on in my young life, I was confronted with the fact that I learned how to speak English before I learned how to speak Swati. And that, for me, emerged a practice of insecurity around my Blackness and my existence in space, which prompted me in my master's project to begin to think about translation as a cartography and how it reimagines my existence in space, depending on which vernacular I decide to see myself through. The second thing that happened was that through my practice, I started to think about languaging my work through the body. The body became a tool for myself to understand how I would begin to think about emerging practices of architecture when words and drawings were not enough. This translated into my second year course of interdisciplinary design, where I collaborated with Y Think Tank to think around what they call the laboratory of new futures or new worlds, where students were tasked to work at the scale of 1-to-1 to produce a project that is a manifestation of their understanding of apartheid spatial planning, providing a commentary on how they see or have reacted to the knowledge that they've attained from that. What I found really interesting about these exercises with my students was that they chose to present in silence, which manifested without me knowing a repeated performance, which I see in myself if I have to present ideas around Blackness and architecture.
Being born into a Swati household grounded in Johannesburg.
I then go back to my childhood globe from my Poldy book. Confronted again, I realize that I never learned how to read myself, even though the Poldy book said it went all around the world. It only went to parts outside of the African continent. This probed me to create my first emergent practice of body and sound, where I started to question my existence in the piece that I'll play now.
There's always been gaps in my cartography. Being born into a Swati household grounded in Johannesburg, there's always been gaps in my cartography, seen in my recollection of place as fractured narratives while attempting to migrate through oral memory as a portal. Stretching the skin, my body, pulling between two worlds, the world of the colonial and the world of my people, creates fractures in my conception of time, space, and place, repeating the cycle of the catastrophic cartography. From when I was 3 years old, growing up in Hillbrow, traveling to Eswatini for the first time, crying as my feet hit the moving soil of my grandfather's home, to the song my sister used to sing to mock me as a child when I couldn't speak isiSwati, to the incorrect greeting of my grandfather as an adult, Unjani mkhulu, awusho njalo wena, that made entry into the home uncomfortable for the first time, when I realized my lack of knowledge of the cultural conditions of place. And when the, why are you running so quickly? As I jogged in the streets of my neighborhood, being stopped by private security vehicles, patrolling the road for potential threats.
Tonoscope test 3, war rhythms. This led to a second iteration that begins to embody the frustration that I felt after realizing just how I am read in space. Understanding the oculocentric architecture of surveillance as something that sees and reads my body when it is unidentified as unwanted, unseen, and scary and threatening, and not understanding the essence of how that manifested, I began to look at more phonocentric tools to articulate architecture as a practice in my Tonoscope project. This manifested from a study that I did in my M2 year, where I looked into the turnstile at FADA as a checkpoint, where I made an experiment to take away the student cards of Black students and ask them to pass through and then attempt to return. The consequence of this was that we all had to fill in disciplinary hearing forms because we were too rude and had too much of an attitude when we were asked to present ourselves and identify ourselves, regardless of the fact that security was fully aware of who we were. The project you just witnessed was a project I undertook with my mentor Nadira Patel with the Goethe-Institut for Power Talks in Johannesburg, where we discussed practices of care around the entry point of Black bodies in space. I was asked to come in as a visual curator, which again was a way that I don't really understand how to work. So I decided to generate sonics to help us encapsulate the experience of the exhibition. This then leads to another practice that I've started to develop, which is the idea of what does it mean to practice architecture when your ear is the only tool to navigate? This is a difficult emerging practice for myself, as it is tough that I haven't found a precedent. However, as my homie said to me at my production studies lecture in the UK, thank you.
what a lovely way to end this little quartet of presentations. So now we've got an opportunity to have a conversation about what we've just seen and to talk and think about it. So I'd like to ask Simphiwe, who has her camera, Patricia to turn her camera, and Titus and Chinenye to turn their cameras on so that we can start having a conversation. There was one question that was posted earlier from Charles Makamo. And Charles's question is, as a GSA graduate, now practicing alongside a diverse group of architects from other universities, I'm interested to learn about what you consider to be your competitive advantage over others. Additionally, I would like to understand the challenges or the disadvantages you may face compared to your peers, particularly in the context of your skills as a GSA alumni. I would appreciate your insights, and the question applies to all of the presenters. So I don't know if any one of you would like to respond to that. It's to all of you, so maybe we can just go through one by one, and you could briefly respond to Charles. Maybe we can start with Chinenye.
Hello again. I'm not sure if I got all the points, but I remember what was our competitive edge, and what challenges are we facing in the real world, practicing alongside other architects from other schools. I don't think there's any disadvantages at all. I think something that we should always acknowledge is, firstly, each person in architecture school is an individual with very different approach to how they practice and how they use their skills. So if you're speaking towards just conventional practice like drawing a drawing, getting a council drawing out, the skill set is there. And if you don't have that after school, you will learn it in 6 months. It doesn't take too long to learn how to make drawings. I think what a nice edge or something that I've noticed is a bit different is the idea of what a drawing is, and thinking is a bit different. So this is also from my background from UCT, but what UJ did for me was kind of refine the way in which I consider things or problems, or thinking outside the box. I know a lot of people say they think outside the box, but it challenges your conventional architectural knowledge when you come to the school. So by the end of the 2 years, when someone poses a question, you often think of it in a different way, and you come up with different solutions. So that gives a fresh outlook in the office space. That's something I've noticed. It often helps in the office to come in with something that people haven't seen before. This is not always, but this is something that I've seen. Thank you.
Thanks, Chinenye. So Titus, if I could, ask you to respond to that, which is about what advantages or disadvantages do you have about other graduates from other schools, and also what your competitive advantage is the question.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the advantages. I think as a GSA alumni, the school really helps you to find your little crevice in architecture and presents a wide range of opportunities for you to find your space. So that is something that the school does really well. Really helps you get comfortable in what you actually want to do. And I think also the way, especially with the approach that the school is going in now, the way it sort of merges the speculative and the real. I find that, again, similar to what Chinenye said, when it comes to problem solving and practicing, it sets you very clearly apart. And as for the challenges, yeah, I would also say that I also don't experience that many challenges. I think one of the challenges that I faced was because there's a lot of information and there's a lot of opportunities, and your definition of architecture is sort of broadened. It can leave you very confused. So you need to be very strategic as to, okay, I'm out of school now. How am I actually going to execute this, or how am I actually going to get this right to to figure out how I'm going to do what I'm interested in. I think, yeah, those are the only things for me.
Thanks, Titus. Patricia, perhaps you could respond to that.
Yeah, to the first part of the question, I think the biggest or the edge that we have as, GSA alumni is understanding that architecture can be anything. I think the people I've worked with or encountered here, they're often surprised that a thesis can be about a genocide, or it can be about an object, and it could be architecture. And I think at the GSA, you can start from any point and make it into architecture. So architecture is everything. And then in terms of, challenges, I think I have been facing a few challenges, or I guess I wouldn't call it disadvantage. I think I wouldn't use disadvantage, but I think working at a firm, you often want to do more than what is needed because you're so used to continuously critiquing and questioning and researching. But when you work at a firm, you find that you have to, work fast, and you have to hone down something and just produce. And so I think that's the disadvantage, I would call it, yeah.
Thanks, Patricia. And then Simphiwe, perhaps you could respond to Charles's question.
Thank you so much, Charles, for your question. When it comes to what is the advantage of being a student at the GSA, I think for myself, I'm not really going to contradict my colleagues, but I think what I find really fascinating about the GSA is that it does not distinguish between speculative and pragmatic as something to be frowned upon. It's really something that we embrace in our practices, that we sort of work between both as an understanding of practice, that you're not stronger because you're speculative, or you're not stronger because you're pragmatic. I think all of us have a way of processing the world in both lenses, even though maybe it manifests in a way that doesn't seem inherently architectural, because we understand architecture as a spatial practice. I think that's what puts us in an advantage. And I think secondly, what it does is that it makes us have really critical lenses to the way that we read space and the world, and particularly African existence. So I think it also gives us a humility when we walk into space to really question, think through what it means to be a practicing architect in whichever facet we exist in. I think the disadvantage is equally that because we're so spatially critical, we're quite conscious when we design. So I think it gives us a level of, I'm not going to necessarily call it fear, but a sort of respect for the practice of architecture, that the act of manifesting a building is a really conscious act that can have real consequences in the world. And I think we understand that even putting pen to paper, the production of an idea, the production of a speculation, the production of a theory has real world spatial impact. So I don't think it's a disadvantage, but for most of us, it means the emerging practices that we generate are practices that really begin to shift the way architectural practice will manifest in the next 10 years. We might not know what that looks like, but it gave us the room and the space to allow these practices to emerge, but not uncontested, not uncritiqued, not unchallenged. So I think for me, that's the advantage, and if we call it a disadvantage, of being a part of the GSA.
Thanks very much for those really interesting responses to Charles's question. Some nice compliments coming through. Helen Luff says, very interesting talks. Thank you to all of those who presented. From Craig, congratulations to all four of you. Wonderful and important work. And Althea says, beautiful and power work from all the presenters. Minendle Gazu says, what an amazing session. I think I'm ready for my master's, thanks to the speakers. And then Charles is thanking you for your responses. He says, thank you very much, all. Very informative responses. Are there any other questions, or would anybody like to comment on what they've seen or what they've heard this evening? Please put your hand up and, we'll be able to respond. Peter Rademeyer is asking, where can we get the recordings? I think I responded earlier to your question, which is all of these talks are placed on the GSA YouTube channel. I'm seeing a hand up there from Veronica Chipwanya. Veronica, what's your question?
Hi, Simphiwe, Patricia, Titus, and Chinenye. I think that was really quite Wow, I think it was an eye-opening presentation from each of you. I think the common thread I'm seeing from all four of you is that you all do your work and you've done your work with excellence. And I think that excellence is really speaking through even into your professional practice. And I've got a question that I hope that maybe specifically Patricia and maybe Titus can respond to. I would ask, what advice would you give to an average student on developing their own creative or alternative architectural practice? And what way of working, or what was your way of working that you learned in the GSA that you have taken into the way you've practiced now? And I'm not talking about project specific, just talking about how your day-to-day way of working and when you receive a project. So yeah, that's my question to Patricia and Titus.
Great. So maybe I'll ask Patricia to respond to that first. Thanks for the question,
Hi,
Veronica.
Hi. So your first question was what advice I'd give to
an average student, yeah,
who wants to start their practice.
Yes.
I would say that they should think of what motivates them, or what, I think let me speak from my own perspective. I think in starting my own practice, I constantly think of why I'm doing what I'm doing and what experiences have brought me to where I am, and what I'd like to change, or what I'd like for people to know or to see. And what I like to reveal to them. So I think if they're starting their practice, I think you'd always have to start from a personal point of view, because you will never lose that. It's something that you're always going to have. And then in terms of the second question, which is how we approach our practice. Yes, I think.
Like your way of working, yes. How do you approach your project? What is your way of working?
I think I take the same way of working from the GSA to now, and that's like constantly through asking questions, through critiquing, through wanting to know more than the information that you're given, and also through asking the questions like why, and also taking the same like tools. So I know I used a lot of mapping. I also used a lot of writing, and continuing those tools and trying to further develop them into the way that I approach the work that I do now. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. So now, Titus, I think Veronica was keen to hear your response to the question as well.
Hi, Veronica. Thank you for the question. So I'll start with the advice. So I would say usually, or when I started my practice, or when I was discovering what my practice was, there was a lot of fear, and there was a lot of uncertainty of basically just being scared of doing the wrong thing, or going the wrong direction and going too far in the wrong direction. So what I would say is that test, yeah, be experimental, don't be afraid to fail. And it's okay if like it doesn't work out the first few tries, but yeah, keep exploring. And for how the GSA has sort of influenced my day-to-day, I would say it first of all starts with just being curious. And when I start something, I sort of step outside of it and look at the best possible way that I could approach it. And it's also given me sort of a sense of responsibility, or this drive where I want to keep going. I want to keep doing what I'm interested in. It's like this fuel in me. But yeah.
Thanks, Titus, and thanks for your question, Veronica. And I see that Azra has her hand up. Azra, would you like to go ahead and share your question or your comment with us?
Yes, thanks, Mark. And thank you to everyone who presented their work, Titus, Simphiwe, Patricia, and Chinenye. I genuinely enjoyed listening to you speak about your work. And, you know, even though you're like very young in your practice, it doesn't seem that way. There is like a level of maturity that comes from the way that you guys speak about your work. I have a comment and a question for Chinenye specifically. Chinenye, like I must say, I really enjoyed listening to you speak about your work. I think there's like a level of like self-awareness and like honesty that comes from it. And I was just wondering, like, have you ever thought of writing or even like writing about your architecture, like in parallel to practicing it?
Azra, thanks for that question. Yes, I have. And I don't call myself a writer because I don't really believe in myself that much as a writer, but I do write. It's something I've taken on a lot more this year, trying to put pen to paper, because I think it's easier for me to put in illustration what I mean. But I guess I'm not claiming it yet as a writer, but I have thought of that, and I will, when I do drop something or when I do publish, I will let you know.
Thank you. And I actually have a second question, and this is also open to like all four of you, but would you say that the work that, or let's say the work and research that you've gone through in your units, would you say that it has like influenced the way you practice? And if so, how?
Who would like to take
I can answer first. I think yes, definitely. And I always I'm very grateful for the supervisors I've had at the GSA. M1 being Yan Gong, and M2 being Ngillan Faal and Simphiwe Mlambo, and Tande Kunguni and Ruth Manda. But particularly because when I started, I remember I still had quite like a rigid way of thinking. And when I say rigid, I mean I knew what outcomes needed to come out to have an architecture product. So I knew how to bring those outputs out. And what Jan did was she was able to like put out different mediums I had never considered as valid points of research or valid points of like engagement. And because of that, I carry that on. And I think also the same question have always been asked, like, why are you doing this? What is the reason for it? So Titus mentioned it earlier, like sometimes when you have that drive or there's something that's pushing you to do something, you don't necessarily need someone to tell you to do it. You just want to uncover more truth. And what Jan and Ngillan do very well is ask, but why? Which is irritating at first, but it's very necessary because then you have to sit to yourself and ask yourself why. And when you ask more whys, more work comes out and you end up uncovering better mediums for yourself. Thank you.
Thanks. So let's move in the order in which we presented to respond to Azra's question. So Titus, perhaps you could share with us your response to Azra's question.
Hi, Azra. Thank you for the question. Yeah, I would say 100%, because I've been in Unit 20, or I was in Unit 20 both my years at the GSA. And coming in, I sort of knew that I was interested in storytelling, and that's what the unit was centered around. And I sort of had an idea of what I thought I was going to approach the storytelling. But in coming into the unit, it changed drastically. It changed drastically, even in the way I practice, in the way I approach my project. And that is also attributed to the unit itself. And like Chinenye mentioned, the unit leaders, the way they push me, or they pushed me to sort of demand more of myself. Because I will admit, like when I came to the GSA, I was a bit comfortable and I was used to playing it safe. But in being in the unit itself, I was really pushed to sort of think beyond how I usually would, and consider more possibilities. And in turn, I've gotten more comfortable, and yeah, I've been growing my skill ever since. And I have high demands of myself now.
Thanks for that, Titus. So Patricia, perhaps you could respond to Azra's prompt, her question.
Same to Chinenye and Titus, for sure. I think it was a lot to do with, the unit leaders discovering something in you that you didn't know you had. It was also about you discovering that you can actually research something that is personal, that is about you, and also it being valid in the space. I think, coming from all our backgrounds, bachelors, at least me and Chinenye were at UCT together, and, you often feel like what you experience as an African, as a woman, can sometimes isn't as validated as in the GSA space. And I think, in understanding that and in having the freedom to now take this thing and make it into an architecture, a space making, manifestation, was something that I took from the GSA, and I continue to take it. So this is, I think, something that for sure GSA has allowed me to do.
Thanks a lot, Patricia. And Simphiwe, perhaps you could share your response to Azra.
Hi, Azra. Thank you so much for your question. I think for myself, the unit system really provided a safe space for me to explore things that were challenging, including sort of confronting my own identity and my own existence and the way that I think about myself and sort of Black practice in the world. So I think for myself, it really created a safe space to do so as a student. But there's an interesting perspective that I've gotten as a tutor about what it means to generate spaces of safety and security, and spaces where it's not just about imparting knowledge, but even equally on our part, it's about learning from students. So I think I find myself learning so much from the practice of the students that I tutor that really challenges the way I thought about my practice. So every day the practice shifts because of the unit system that I'm in, even the camaraderie amongst the different units and the exchanges that we have about what we understand architecture to be has really been valuable. Myself coming from 2 units that were really, really speculative in nature. So Unit 21 with Craig and Azra, and Unit 18 with Nadira and Sarah. It was a really amazing experience for myself to find a language and a space that helps me think through and produce architecture in a way that felt more authentic. So I think the authenticity project for myself that manifested was really my biggest outcome that I've gotten from the system. Yeah, so I think that's the best answer I can give.
Great, thanks so much for your prompt and your question, Azra. Really interesting. I'm going to read out a comment before we go to the next question from Lone Paulson. And Lone says, my advice is not to lose what you learnt and experienced at the GSA as you get involved in so-called real world or conventional practice, in scare quotes. The process is really valuable in thinking about and formulating conceptual design ideas that involve into architectural projects. Thank you for that, Lone. And I see that Olive Olusegun has her hand up. Olive, if you'd like to take the mic and pose your question.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you, guys. These were really fantastic presentations. It's really lovely to see what you guys have done. So I think the thing that is so fantastic that I noticed across the board is just how much of a multidisciplinary approach all of you guys have and the multidisciplinary spaces that you're currently in. And I think it lends itself to the mediums that you guys are using. So I think the 2 questions that I have is, number 1, how do you find yourself navigating these spaces that are outside of architecture? And then also, how do you actually get into these spaces? I think it's so important that we speak to not only architects, and I think it's fantastic that you guys are doing that. And I think it would be so beneficial for everyone to kind of understand how that works. Yeah, that's the question. Thanks, guys.
Hey, thanks very much, Olive. That's a really lovely, provocative question. So the first part is, how do you navigate spaces outside of conventional architectural practice? And the other part of the question is, how do you get into them? So let's start with Chinenye to give us a response to that.
I think that's a nice question. That's a really nice question. One, I think a key to the world is architecture. Like, saying you're an architect often opens a lot of doors. Like, something I've noticed is, like, I can walk into a building most times, not all, please don't do this, don't quote me, but you can go into a building and say, hey, I like your building, I'm an architect, can I walk through? And they'll take you around the building. And that's always been like something I've enjoyed. And I think in the same way, architecture is the key, or framing it in that way, is a very long, strenuous, like, pathway you put yourself on, and you find very hard to leave, but it adapts the way you view the world. And because of that, you take into consideration the way you watch films, you look at art, you read books. When people tell stories, you're prompted to think of what spaces these stories are existing within. So in that way, I think that's my answer. I think it's a key. In many ways, I move around the world as an architect because it's shown, or it's framed the way that I look at things and I experience things. And in the same way, it's also exposed me to so much more things. Yeah, that's the best I got, Olive. I'm sorry.
Good question, Olive, and good response, Chinenye. So Titus, perhaps you'd like to share how you navigate spaces outside of architecture and how you get into them.
I think for me, the simple answer is I use architecture to get into these spaces. So already I'm an artist, but because I try and attach architecture to everything that I do, it sort of already provides a conversation that lends into both disciplines. So not just art or not just architecture or whatever I'm attaching the architecture to, but because it's two conversations that are being had, or basically two aspects that I'm including in sorry, because I'm including architecture into whatever I'm doing, or making it sort of like an interdisciplinary thing. It already portrays me as an architect, and that's sort of how I get myself into it. And like I said, that's in art that I do, that's in the films that I do, that in one way or another have an architectural aspect to them. But yeah, short answer, I use architecture.
Thanks, Titus. Patricia.
How do I use architecture how do I navigate spaces outside of architecture, and how do I get into them?
That's how I understood the question, yeah.
Okay. How I navigate spaces outside of architecture, I mean, through architecture, yes, but I also think that, yeah, I mean, my short answer is through architecture. How I navigate spaces. This question is very complex, Olive. I think it's actually, yeah. I'm like, what? Yeah, use architecture, but then how do I navigate spaces outside of architecture? Is again through architecture, but through other facets of architecture, not the conventional architecture. Yeah.
Good save.
I think, yeah, that's what.
And Simphiwe, what is your reflection on that prompt from Olive?
I'm so scared to answer this question. Thank you so much, Olive, for tricking us into answering this. I think if I were to give the most honest answer that I can, how do you get into architectural or spaces outside of architecture's network? To be honest, yes, architecture gets us in the room, but I think the practice that I guess we've all established, having to work outside of the mediums of architecture, make access into these spaces not, I don't want to say easier, but it opens the door in a nice way. But I do think we have to be honest about having to understand the network of the fields in question. So I think because we've had such a diverse number of people from different disciplines participate at the GSA, we're privileged enough to have people that have access to these networks and these worlds and these spaces that we wouldn't otherwise have access to, which I think is a really nice thing to experience. So I want to be honest about the fact that it is the school that we come from that gives us access to these networks and these spaces that then allows us to use the tools that we've generated and test them and sort of fail and try and in these spaces with a level of care, and sort of they can hold us in because we've generated these skills. But we also have mentors and personnel and people and a network that can sort of help us navigate the space with a level of clarity that might not necessarily exist when we don't have those networks. So as much as our skill and our talents are amazing, that counts.
Hey, thank you. And that was, I think, a lovely question. And Olive says, thank you for a lovely range of good answers. Thank you, guys. I think that's perhaps a nice point to, bring to a close what's been a really enchanting and enticing and stimulating evening. So I'd like to thank Chinenye, Titus, Patricia, and Simphiwe for participating this evening. I think it's been really very valuable to hear the way you are positioning yourselves. I know that you all have quite extraordinary practice lives ahead of you, and from the work you've done here and the work you're doing now. So thank you so much for sharing. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us this evening, and also big up to the ops team. Boitumelo Mazibuka, who normally manages this, is not with us this evening. She's having to attend to a family matter. So we have Leslie, Gavisile, Deshni here with us, and Denise in the background holding it all together. So I'd like to thank Ops as well for their hard work and making this is an unusual presentation because we've got 4 presenters in 3 different countries, and I think it's worked really well. So thank you for all the effort. And thank you again, everybody, for coming. If you look in the chat, anybody that wants to claim CPD points, you can get the information there. You want to grab it and snatch the link there. Also to let you know that this will be posted on our YouTube channel after it's been processed, so you can dip into it again if there's anything interesting that you'd like to hear again. Thank you for coming, and I do hope that we see you all next week for the presentation by Melanie Archer, who studied architecture but now does not practice as an architect, but has a really fascinating practice designing books. I do hope we can see you there to join her and to hear about her practice. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to the presenters, and we look forward to seeing you at the next practice lecture. Thank you.